You're listening to episode 208 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Gil Fronsdal joins us to speak about his upcoming book, a translation of the Pali Atthakavagga, the Book of Eights. Not all the books in the Pali Canon are easy to find in English, let alone translations that resonate with contemporary sensibilities. The books of the Sutta Nipata are some of the earliest in the chronology of the canon, and our guest today will be discussing naturalized Buddhism and how it relates to the Atthakavagga. Gil Fronsdal is the primary teacher for the Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California. He has been teaching since 1990. He has practiced Zen and Vipassana in the US and Asia since 1975, was a Theravada monk in Burma in 1985, and in 1989 began training with Jack Kornfield to be a Vipassana teacher. Gil teaches at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, where he is part of its teacher council. Gil was ordained as a Soto Zen priest at the San Francisco Zen Center in 1982, and in 1995 received Dharma transmission from Mel Weitzman, the abbot of the Berkeley Zen Center. Gil has an undergraduate degree in agriculture from UC Davis, where he was active in promoting the field of sustainable farming. In 1998, he received a PhD in religious studies from Stanford University, studying the earliest developments of the Bodhisattva ideal. He is the author of The Issue at Hand, Essays on Mindfulness Practice, A Monastery Within, and a translation of the Dhammapada. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Earl Greyer tea. And our guest today is Gil Fronsdal. Gil, thanks for being here.
I look forward to talking to you.
So we're going to talk today about a book that you have coming out, the Atthakavagga. And we're going to start, though, by talking a little bit about your background as a teacher and how you first encountered Buddhism and what prompted you to pursue teaching.
Yeah, I usually say that I had two encounters with Buddhism that brought me in. First was intellectually. It was in college, in the first 2 years in college, we had a lot of intense conversations about the Vietnam War, about the ecological crisis. And among my college friends, we were looking for some way to respond. And so we took classes in environmental studies, and then we realized we had to deal with the politics. We took classes in political science, and then we thought, well, it's not just politics, it has to do with the whole mindset, the state of mind that people have, the whole attitude people have towards life and the world. And so we started looking into Eastern religion. And as we did that, I got very interested in Buddhism. And I was also a pacifist, and realizing that if I was going to live my pacifist ideals, I'd have to be willing to put my life on the line in nonviolent civil disobedience. And I was afraid of that. And so I didn't feel good about not being able to live my ideals. So I was looking around for some way of dealing with this fear of death. And again, I came to Buddhism as offering an antidote, offering a solution to that. that got my interest. It was more intellectual in some ways, my initial interest. And then a couple of years later, I was suffering. I was lonely, felt alienated, felt rudderless in the world. And I had this idea that meditation would help me. And so then I started meditating and doing the Zen meditation I'd learned. And so with my suffering, I got to really start practicing. And then I started practicing, and it became very meaningful very quickly for me. And I just kept doing it. And doing it, and as it became more meaningful, meditation, then I took it to the next step, which to move to San Francisco to be near a Zen center in San Francisco, and then live at Zen center, and then be ordained as a priest, and then continue practicing in Asia, and just kind of all followed.
So let's talk a little bit about an article that you had recently published in Insight Journal, that's from the Barry Center of Buddhist Studies, where you're talking a bit about a difference between secular Buddhism, as we were both attendees at a secular Buddhist colloquium in 2013, from a natural Buddhism. How do you distinguish those two?
Yeah, I mean, so this might be my own idiosyncratic relationship with these words. So for me, when I think of the word secular, I can't help but to feel a very strong divide from something that would be religious, spiritual, sacred, some feeling or sense of personal transformation that has come, that I felt through my practice. And the word secular seems like almost like civic. It means, in my little mind, it means like almost like civic. It's like it has nothing to do with that world of practice that I'm familiar with. So I just can't get myself behind the word secular because of not seeing in it the world of practice that I've done and the experiences that I've had that are so important for me. The word natural works better for me because these transformations and the experiences that I had do feel extremely natural. I don't necessarily understand everything, but they're experienced directly, like I would experience a sunset or looking at the stars or walking in nature. And so they feel very natural. And also, the word natural, one of the feelings about secular is that it's defining an approach to Buddhism, secular Buddhism, in opposition to a more religious form of Buddhism. And it's very vague what this divide is supposed to represent. Whereas natural, in my mind, stands by itself and differentiates it from something that's very clear, and that is the kind of Buddhism that is not natural, which is supernatural, and that includes something which is not part of the natural world in the sense of something we can see and understand in a direct experiential way. And also, rather than use the word secular Buddhism, and again, in my idiosyncratic way of seeing it, it feels almost like secular Buddhists have to explain to the world why they're using the term. The word natural Buddhism, maybe it's explained to the world as well. That's why you're asking me. But I'm hoping it puts a little bit of the responsibility for the people who believe in the supernatural aspect of Buddhism to explain what they're doing, to be accountable to it. I'm sure they'd rather not be called supernatural Buddhists. And so it puts them in a spot to try to explain what it is they're doing, how does this fit into their religion. And the reason I like to do that is that the people who are natural Buddhists, secular Buddhists, I see them often having to be on the defensive, that the real Buddhists, the traditional Buddhists, the people who say we're rooted in the teachings of the Buddha, sometimes Buddhist fundamentalists, sometimes very critical of the secular Buddhists for watering it down, for misreading the suttas, for cherry-picking through the discourses for what they like. And so I was kind of hoping also a little bit turn the table on them so they leave us alone a little bit more. I mostly want to be left alone. Let me do my Buddhism the way I like, the way it works for me, but left alone. But also that, they'll say, look, maybe you need to explain yourself. What do you do with this? What is the supernatural elements you believe in? And in Buddhism has a lot of it. I think almost every Buddhist tradition I've known, in some corner of it, is chock full of some pretty amazing supernatural beliefs and ideas. And rebirth just being one of the more obvious ones that everyone knows about. There's ideas of other world systems and gods and hells and the workings of karma in somewhat mechanistic ways from one life to the next. There's no shortage of these supernatural magical beliefs.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point that we're often put on the defensive by a presumption of the position of privilege of a tradition. And we're often in that same boat as atheists in a typically religious culture to assume and cater to a presumed privilege of Christianity in our society, which I don't. And one of the questions that I frequently ask within that context is the same one I ask with our more traditional friends, which is, if we're not doing it right, it means that you have a one true Buddhism. You have a ruler by which you're measuring and finding we don't measure up. So what parts are right and what parts aren't right? If you're telling me that you accept that Buddha was gold and he glowed and his hands hung below his knees, is that stuff that you accept? And that I usually don't get an answer with that.
Right. So what turns out is that there's so much material in Buddhism we have to kind of relate to if you're taking the whole tradition seriously. And I think everybody has to pick and choose through it. There's a selection process that everyone does. Mm-hmm. Even some of the people who see themselves as, being very faithful to the early tradition, to the Theravada tradition, for example, they don't realize how much they're picking and choosing. And they're doing it just as much as the so-called secular Buddhists or other people are doing as well. And so one of my hopes is to help people, encourage all of us to become much more responsible and self-aware of the assumptions and the choices in the selection process for the kind of Buddhist teachings that we're involved in.
Yeah, to do so with mindful awareness of where we're agreeing and other parts that we don't find are beneficial to us in our practice. It's not that they're wrong for others. It's simply that they don't play a part in what we do.
And one of the things for me was the way that when I was practicing in Asia, I was relatively young. I didn't know much about the tradition. And I practiced with some pretty old Buddhist masters in Asia and who had established institutions. And I took them to represent the orthodoxy. Many years later, I discovered that they were the progressive in their time, and they were involved in a lot of controversy with the established traditions of their time, needing to explain themselves and having their books burned, having Mahasi Sayadaw, I think he went to Sri Lanka, had stones thrown at him for being so radical and different and progressive. And so I think every generation, my assumption is every generation is recreating Buddhism for itself. It's a constant process of creation. We don't really notice it or we forget this. And so the orthodoxy of Theravada Buddhism today was itself a selection process 50 years ago, 70 years ago. So we're just continuing this. Every generation is trying to find its way with the tradition. And hopefully it's for the betterment of humankind, the alleviation of suffering.
Yeah, I completely agree that that's really what this is about. And it's always kind of difficult when you get into one of those situations where you're in a place where you're having to justify that your practice is something that may still be of value in the reduction of suffering. And the accusations of watering it down are always, I'm most entertained when that comes from someone from the Mahayana tradition. Of course, the Mahayana tradition was its own watering down and changing of the orthodoxy. And I also liked your description of the difference between secular and a natural Buddhism. It's interesting how words have such individual meaning, and I sincerely appreciate you stating very clearly that that's your own nuanced understanding of words, because those are essentially the same descriptions I use the other way around.
Wonderful.
The secular to me, and I've had many conversations with folks who have, there is, of course, I think a baggage around the word secular that it is often heard in opposition to the sacred. And that's really, for many of us, that's not what it is. There's still that which is deeply transformative, inspiring, and moving to us. To me, that is encapsulated by that term secular as it is to you with the word natural. So it's interesting how that works.
Yeah, I think it's very important in these kinds of discussions to be clear about the words we're using and how we're using them. Because sometimes the the conflict and the controversy is more semantic than real.
Yeah. It's attachment to views any of the time. So how do you see a belief in the supernatural as contributing to, or perhaps not contributing to, progress on the path?
I think it can contribute to progress on the path if it motivates people to practice. And sometimes either the idea of supernatural, belief in supernatural, or people have, or they think our experiences that contribute to the supernatural, that it can be very inspiring. It can lend more authority to the teachings and the practice that they're familiar with. It can validate them, because if these supernatural things are true, then certainly the rest of it must be true. Or there's more to this life than I realize. This is an awesome life. I better get on with it. So I think that it can be very motivating. Sometimes the idea of the supernatural also can motivate people to be more ethical, because they realize that ethics has many unseen consequences that they never realized before. But somehow the unseen supernatural world, it has an impact or a relationship to it. And so, for example, if you believe in rebirth, for most people, that's an unseen world. A lot of people believe it on faith. But it's very motivating to believe in rebirth for some people, because I don't want to come back punished by my bad karma. I want to have good karma and create good conditions for the next lifetime. The idea of multiple lives for some people very much motivates their practice, because they want to get off the wheel of rebirth. And so, they're really on fire to do that. And if they didn't believe in rebirth, if they just, we have one lifetime and then that's it, then why would they practice this? Then they're basically free of samsara anyway at the end. So we're discouraged them from practice. So I think the supernatural is supportive for some people. Other people, it's actually discouraging. Some people find, like myself, that I have to practice Buddhism in a way that's honest for myself. And I have a hard time, or it's impossible for me to believe something that I don't believe, to believe something that I don't have a reasonable experience of or reasonable understanding of how it might actually be the case. And so how believing the supernatural can get in the way, it gets in the way because people can get distracted by it. It can get them off, moving in directions away from practice itself, the practice of liberation. People can get involved in magic. They can get involved in all kinds of other motivations. The desire for supernatural powers becomes more important than liberation. Sometimes the belief in rebirth, rather than encouraging someone to practice harder, actually hinders practice, because people can decide to put off practice to a future lifetime. And so you take it easy, or decide I've done enough for this lifetime, I'm set for now. So I think it can work, it can go both ways. For some people, it can be encouraging their practice, and some people it can be discouraging.
So let's shift a little bit and talk about the Atthakavagga, where that is in the canon, how it connects to natural Buddhism.
Yes, it's an anthology of 16 suttas, 16 set of verses. That's in what's called the Khuddaka. It's in the Sutta Nipata. And the Sutta Nipata is a collection, itself is a larger anthology of 5 chapters. And Atthakavagga is one chapter. And that itself is in a larger anthology still called the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is the collection of miscellaneous texts. It's one of the 5 anthologies of discourses of the Buddha. And the Atthakavagga, most likely from very early time, was a self-standing, independent collection of discourses, of sets of verses, because it's mentioned in the suttas themselves. And people recited them in front of the Buddha, and the Buddha approved. People asked if Buddha knew about them. And also there's a very, very the earliest commentary that's canonical, that's actually in the Theravada sacred literature, is a commentary on the Atthakavagga. So it's considered to be very old, and many scholars believe that because of the language, because of the themes, what's being discussed there, because it's already mentioned in the other texts as well, that it must be among the oldest literature in Buddhism. And it may be dating back to the earliest teachings of the Buddha or the earliest teachings of this early tradition. So its earliness, before Buddhist teachings became systematized, before it added a lot of different elements from the religious environment of its time, I think for this reason it's a very valuable document. Even if it's not early, it shows that there's a way of presenting the path to liberation that is different from how it's presented in the early discourses as a whole. And one of the differences is that it offers a kind of a discussion of, a radical discussion of liberation, the path to liberation, which does not have has no emphasis on the supernatural. It doesn't have a role there at all. But also doesn't champion certain doctrines or religions as being the ultimate truth. In fact, the whole pursuit of what's ultimate is seen to go against the movement towards liberation, because it becomes fixing on views. And this idea of not having fixed views or not being dependent on doctrine and seeing that liberation is possible here and now, I find very refreshing. And I find it very freeing, and freeing me from a lot of different baggage that tends to go along with with Buddhist teachings.
So it is it's a book of 8. Tell us about those 8 parts.
Well, Atthakavagga means Book of Eights. At least that's what we think it means. The scholars generally think the reason it's called a Book of Eights is that there's a set of them kind of in the middle of those 16, which had 8 verses in them. And so it's because of those that had 8 verses, it's called the Book of Eights. So that's the reason for that title, maybe. I think that answered your question.
Yep. So let's talk for a little bit about the word saddha, Pali word, often translated as faith. And that may have a somewhat nuanced interpretation than how we use the word faith in Judeo-Christian contexts. Can we talk about that for just a moment?
Yeah, it's not clear to me how saddha should be translated into English. I know that most commonly it's translated as faith. Some translators have used the word confidence, and some have used the word conviction. Exactly how it's supposed to be understood in English, again, it has to do with semantics. It has to do with associations people have what these words mean in the different languages. And some of these words have a range of associations for different people. And some of it has to do with people's emotional relationship to words. So I like the word faith as a translation because I was raised atheist, and I don't have any associations to the word faith that maybe a Christian would have. Some people have a problematic relationship to the word faith because of how they were raised as a Christian, and they're required to believe things in faith as if they're believing having blind faith in doctrines and tenets. So I don't have a negative association with the word, but I have a positive association with faith because for me it has to do with the heartfelt quality of trust, of warmth, of almost like love. An element of heartfulness comes in that the words conviction and confidence doesn't really have. Sometimes I like the word trust. But certainly I think we should, whatever saddha is in Buddhism, it should be defined in Buddhist terms, and defined with how the word is actually used in the suttas. So if we translate saddha as faith, then faith should be defined in Buddhist terms, not in Christian ones.
Yeah, a very good point. That the context of it isn't just a simple matter of translating the word separate from the embedded situation in which it's in, because it can have many different meanings. And I think that the thing that is missing in our translation of saddha is confidence. That although certainly that's a nuanced flavor and aspect of it, as you said, it's missing that emotive context, that heart aspect to it.
And sometimes I like the word trust a lot in myself, and that's been an important concept to me, to trust and to relax and trust in the practice, trust in the Dharma. In fact, trust has been so important at times in my practice. I've had a very strong, visceral, alive, meaningful sense of just being trusting without having an object of the trust. It's more like there's a open, boundless quality of trust that supported me, that held me, that flowed through me, that didn't require an object. And people ask me, what do you trust? And I say, I don't trust anything. I just trust.
Yeah, there doesn't have to be an object, particularly in Buddhist practice.
And some people have been perplexed by because they think it has to have an object. But, in my own experience, that has been times when I haven't felt that. I just felt trust is there, and it's very meaningful. The faith is also, the other reason I like the word faith is that there is a feeling of, I don't feel like I know everything about Buddhism, about reality, about the practice and liberation. And I think the whole Dharma is much bigger than my understanding, much bigger than me. And so I like the word faith because it does allow for space for the unknown. Whereas confidence and conviction, at least in my mind, just seem more like you really know something for yourself, and you kind of know the boundaries of something, you know the domain. I like the word faith because I kind of appreciate that I'm still a learner, still want to learn, and I have faith in the Dharma, I have faith in the teachings, and still trying to understand them.
Yeah, an underlying thread of humility that we don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to know every step of the territory before we start on a map and go on a journey and continue on it.
And I have tremendous faith, confidence, conviction, trust in the practices that I have done for all these years. And what opens up as I do these practices, patterns of cause and effect that move forward from doing these practices, is something I believe in deeply.
So, Gil, what do you think would help foster the growth of natural Buddhism in contemporary and increasingly global community?
Oh, I don't have much hope that's going to grow. I think that I'm more interested in supporting the people who are interested in Buddhism, but are a little bit turned off or a little bit feel claustrophobic by some of the contact they have with supernatural Buddhism. So it's more like a reassurance or offering something to people who are already interested. But what would foster it, the growth of it? Two things come to mind that I would like to see happen. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of understanding the early Buddhist teachings. If you do a survey of the history of Buddhist teachings down through time, there's a very strong correlation that for many centuries, the further away you get from the Buddha, the more supernatural Buddhism becomes. Mm-hmm. And the Buddha himself becomes more and more of a supernatural being, until in some traditions, he's almost like a god, or he is a god. And so, if you go back to the earliest tradition, you get very little of all the supernatural developments. And so, I think there's a lot of room to really analyzing and dissecting and doing text-critical work on these early texts. And I think that as we do that in a more and more careful way, we'll find that there's more natural Buddhism in the teaching of the Buddha than we realize. I believe that we'll begin being able to separate out the supernatural from the natural and see that the natural Buddhism, it probably qualifies as more closer to what the Buddha taught than has been appreciated so far. So that's one way I think to support the growth of natural Buddhism, to understand that there are authoritative reasons in the tradition itself to stand on, to support that approach to Buddhism. The other is, I think it would help everyone if we understood that, as I said earlier, that every generation has to figure out Buddhism for itself. Every generation is doing a selection process. Every country, every society where Buddhism comes to has to do this very dynamic interaction between Buddhism and the society of figuring out what parts of Buddhism get translated and what parts of Buddhism get converted in the process of going into new society. What gets adapted, what gets adopted. And if we just adopted Asian Buddhism wholesale, we probably wouldn't even have Buddhism anymore. But if we adapt it too much, and then it becomes just another form of Western religion. It's possible to read Buddhism through the lens of Western worldviews and lose Buddhism that way as well. But if we can understand the process of adaptation, selection, what the criteria of why we're doing it, how we have to do it, then I think there's more room for appreciating natural Buddhism as a valid approach to a path of liberation, and that for some people it is inevitable. The third thing that would help, I hope it would help, I don't know if it will, I hope that some of the more naive forms of supernatural beliefs, somehow or other, we could show that they're not really worthwhile holding on to. They're not really not worth believing in. And then we find more and more people sloughing them off and not believing them anymore. And that some of the things, I mean, already that's happened, right? I mean, some of the supernatural beliefs that have been part of Buddhism for many centuries are really not talked about or really not believed in by some Western Buddhists who do believe in things like rebirth. I know people who certainly believe in rebirth, and happily so, but they don't believe in the Buddhist teachings on hell. Or they don't believe in the 33 levels to heaven.
Or the colorful rays of light emanating from Buddha at all times.
Or that the Buddha actually never got dirty, ever. He took a bath. He wasn't really taking a bath because he wasn't dirty. Dust never stuck to his skin. He was just doing it as an example to others that it's good for them to get clean. So already there's a lot of supernatural beliefs that we don't believe in. And hopefully as we give deeper exploration, deeper consideration in some of the beliefs we hold, and more of the supernatural beliefs people have will fall away.
We'll see what comes in the future. And our guest today has been Gil Fronsdal, and you can find out more about much of his work at insightmeditationcenter.org. Thanks, Gil, for being here. Appreciate the talk today.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate your questions.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.